Thank you all for coming. My name is Paolo Drino. I help to convene these seminars. You're very welcome to come we meet every 2 weeks. For some of you, the topics we'll be looking at in later weeks may not be as close to your research interest, but you're very welcome to come. I'm glad you're here. And it's great that we can kick off this year's seminar with Cristiana, who has come from Brazil. She's doing a series of activities here in the UK for the next couple of weeks, but I think we got you first. Yes. This is great. And she's going to talk, as you can see here, on psychiatry in context, the problem of degeneration in Brazil.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the invitation, Paul. It's very nice to be here. It's the first place I am in UK, really, and I'm very interested in seeing how I can, if I made myself understandable. So please, I apologize for my poor English. If it's not good, ask me, okay? What I will present today is part of a research, of a 3 years research, and I am coordinating this enormous group of senior researchers. We are 10 senior researchers from different institutions in Rio de Janeiro, and we are working with the National Hospital, the National Hospital of the Alienated, or of psychopaths, it depends on the time, which was the first institution in South America. It began in 1852 and it finished in 1944 when it turned to be another institution, right? So we congregate many different interests about this institution. We are trying to understand the day-by-day activities and practice of people there. So we are working with clinical records and with administrative records from these institutions, and because of that we are also making research on one side, and the other side we are treating these documents, which most of them are endangered, and we are trying to organize and virtualize them so other people can also use them for research. So it's a huge enterprise, right? I am interested especially in psychotherapy in the institution. This is my main interest. Especially I'm interested in how people diagnosed as degenerated were treated, and if there was a thought of cure for them or not. Now we began last December, so I'm still collecting documents. I couldn't tell you now many things about this diagnosis, but as I'm collecting it, I'm also reading journals to understand the meanings of this diagnosis. Okay. I'm particularly interested in a diagnosis named atypical degeneration state. When people don't have delusions, they don't have illusions, they don't have hallucinations, but they are treated as mad people because they are incorrigible. They are not disciplined. They don't accept. They don't get educated, so they stay in the hospital. and most of them are women. Most of them were people who didn't want to take care of their houses, and were people who use men clothes and things like that. And we are accompanying them in the 30s. These ladies, most of them were women, as I said. They would be as psychotherapy. It would be used psychosurgery. They would call psychotherapy, but in reality they would use in those people which they said they have chronic bad behavior, this psychosurgery. And I'm trying to understand first the idea of psychotherapy in a surgery like that. Second, what they call them cure for those people. It looks like people who are very much sexualized, for example, when they get less sexualized, this is a direction of cure, for example. Okay? But it's still, I could not tell you this is the way it looks like. Yeah, I have to make more research. And in the meantime, I decided to try to understand the concepts of degeneration, so that when I can come to analyze these documents, I can work better with this concept. So, what I will try to show you today then is the notion of degeneration in Brazil. First, the idea of climate, and also the different models of madness until 1850. It's a prolegomena I'm trying to do, because I'm not sure if you have these ideas, and so I decided to make a small introduction, and then I will speak about the Moral and Magnum degeneration theories, which are psychiatrists, very important ones for Brazilian psychiatry. And then I'll speak about how the psychiatrists in Brazil received the concept of degeneration. Okay? Bom. In the 18th century, the climate turned out to be the first and more powerful of all empires, according to Montesquieu. Many of the philosophers, natural philosophers, then like Buffon, for example, would think that in the case of the New World, its humidity and its unhealthy vapors were responsible for the inferiority of animals and human beings as well. In the beginning of the 19th century, naturalists would travel around Brazil, like von Martius, Spix, and also van Hagen, still stated, in accordance to the 18th century theories, like the ones of Buffon, that before being victims of European conquerors, the natives of Brazil were victims of climate, of soil, and of the nature of their continent, which prevented any kind of human industry. From this point of view, the indigenous population were testimony of immobility and of stagnation of the human race. Okay? And was unrecoverable for civilizing purposes. It's very important here to think about this idea of stagnation. This is the point that is going to be important for us afterwards. Okay. In the beginning of the 18th, when the monarchy arrived in Brazil in 1808, and with the opening of the ports, as well as with Humboldt theses about America, some things began to change. Especially, they would speak about the potential and the fertility of the new world. But although they would speak about this diversity, the creativity of the world, the idea of ambivalence prevailed. At once, the world was still divided into two poles, one of work and reason, and the other one of delight and of backwardness. No? These ideas I would like you to maintain, this ambivalence with the new world, and this idea that there was paralyzation of the world, although it had a potential now for fertility. It has to be a little bit with the models of alienation that we have in the first beginning of the alienation. Pinel in 1801 would say that everybody could be alienated. So it was just one man, one race, one human, but the climate, the food, the intoxications, the humidities could, and especially the passions, could alter people to the point they would lose their consciousness. The idea of madness at this point is the counterpart of the ambivalence and the counterpart of the consciousness. People, human beings, they think. That's the most important quality of the human being. And because of that, he would begin to say it's possible to cure mad people because our essence of being is the conscious. So it's possible to bring back conscious to people. Okay? The second model is the localizationist. It was a finding of Bale in 42 that some illnesses could be found in the brain. So it was a big hope that the alienation, which was just understood by behaviors and signals, could finally find the causal, the cause. Right? But this model was not proved, or mostly not proved, except for some neurological damages. Later on, what Bale saw, it was be called syphilis, but at the time it was the PGP, the progress paralysis. The third model is in reality is the same as Esquirol was from the school of Pinel. He systemized Pinelian thought, but he made a new diagnosis, a new classification, and in this classification there was a monomania. Monomania would be a madness, which was not a disturbance of consciousness, but a disturbance of the will power. So we are beginning to understand madness not anymore as the lack of consciousness, but the lack of control. It's in this point madness begins to get very dangerous as well. And it's thought as an imbalance, as a close to what I wanted to say is with monomania, there is a big danger not to see the crazy person. It's not so easy anymore to see the difference between someone who is crazy than someone who is not. Because this monomaniac, he's crazy only about one thing. For example, about a woman or about a specific story. At the other things, he's just perfect and conscious. And about this point, he has some illusions. But sometimes you cannot see them. It's different from someone who hallucinates, right? Who loses her consciousness. Okay? Pierre Darmon pointed out that Benedict Morel would have been the first to give biomorphologic support to the rational or lucid madness marked by Esquirol, inserting it into the category of the degenerated. But let us understand the Morellian degeneration. Morel introduced a break in the course of the species in history. On the one hand, the word would be set by God, the Creator, a sense of human history that is intertwined with the teleology. At the other side, there would be a path taken by man towards the adventure of the free will, which marked a degree of uncertainty about their fate, with many risks of degradation. After the publication of the Traité de Degeneration in 1857, the generations began to be defined as the degradation that originates in human nature. They were treated as an unhealthy deviation, a degradation of the perfect primitive human race created by God to be passed down from generation to generation. Thus, Morel used the dogma of creation as an original sin, as well as transformism, in order to conceive his theory of degeneration. According to the author, the transmission of abnormalities, flaws, and physical and moral stigmas would provoke a complete change in the nature of the lineage of future generations. The equilibrium of the human species, its divine regeneration, was only possible through the extinction of this degenerate race. Even medicine was incapable of intervening in the already established deviation, so that medical scientific efforts needed to focus on prevention, right? So the idea is that you have a perfect human race, only one human race, and that this deviation makes another kind of race, which is degenerated, and that's getting even each generation it gets more and more deviated from the first perfect human beings. At the end, they cannot have children anymore because God is good and perfect. They would finish this degeneration by extinguishing this race, okay? These people. Morel articulated a serious social control practice aimed at promoting the health of the population and enlightening political and administrative institutions. According to him, the degeneration was due to a variety of causes: different types of intoxication, close linked to eating habits, social influences, bad hygiene, terrible working conditions, excessive venery and poverty, effects of urban expansion, harmful elements of the soil, social and moral hazards, and finally psychical causes that produced lesions in the nervous system. However, moral was favored to mixed causes. Alcoholism, for example, would be considered a mixture between physical and psychological cause. The affirmative underlined another important characteristic of degeneration, its universal nature. Even so, some individuals were most exposed to degeneration than others, due to family or due to individual predisposition. So if I drink too much, if I go out and have a lot of boyfriends or girlfriends, I will be predisposed to this deviation. Okay, my sons can have hysteria because of that, and my grandson can get epilepsy because of that. There is a transformation as well, and it is getting always worse until the end of the matrix. I don't know. In the 80s, Valentin Magnum, another French alienist whose theory of degeneration gathered a loyal following in Brazil, defined degeneration in a different way. He would say it would be an individual pathological state of diminished psychophysical resistance and partial or complete impotence in biological conditions in the hereditary fight for life. This diminished resistance, which resulted in permanent stigmas, was seen as progressive by Magnum and would culminate in the annihilation of the species as well. It's also worth highlighting another characteristic that defines the condition of the degenerate being, namely the imbalance. Based on the polygenic concept of the origin of species, and in this sense opposing himself to Morellian theory, Magnum believed that the racial mixture created disharmony that resulted in degradation due to the evolutionary differences between each race. Together with other polygynists, he defended the idea that miscegenation symbolized the fundamental difference between races and personified degeneration. The degenerates were abnormal beings with a mechanical cerebral distortion, brain distortion, which resulted in the relentless destruction of the balance of all functions of the brain. Contrary to Morel, Magnum constructed a physiological concept of madness, not taking into consideration metaphysics and creationism. Madness consisted of pathological forms under neurophysiological concept of degeneracy. Thus, it was an evolutionary disease, where the deviants were condemned, as were their descendants, until the lineage became extinct as well. For Magnum, the causes of degeneration were many and varied, as well as according to the current idea that it was a kind of reverse of the civilization. Every era would have a specific repertoire of as a necessary complement of the progressional evolution of the world, okay, of the movement. However, the degenerated product hardly varied in its characteristics, whatever the cause was. They were divided into two classes: hereditary influences and acquired or accidental influences. Great emphasis on alcohol, and he participated in several anti-alcoholic leagues. He thought that alcohol was one of the most important degenerating external causes. Well, having Having made these preliminary remarks, let's go back to my object. Okay. Especially from the 1870s on, this is I didn't put it, but this is a photograph made by Agassi when he was in Brazil, okay? Especially from 1871, as the abolitionist movement grew in Brazil, the relation between race and mental illness was triggered in Brazil by the newly institutionalized local psychiatrists, further complexifying the interpretation of the miscegenated country. Roelcke and Magnum were authors who had a huge impact on the local psychiatric milieu. The debate about race, miscegenation, and climate towards the end of the 19th century added even more to the atmosphere of doom and pessimism perpetrated by authors such as Arthur Gobineau, Louis Agassi, and Gustave Aimar, among so many other authors who declaimed the unfeasibility of the Brazilian nation due to the quality of its people. These hegemonic theories of the time, the local intellectual elite began to make an effort to find a way out of them, looking for a solution to make the modern nation viable and ensure regeneration. Many intellectuals of the country took part in the debate about the racial issues of the Brazilian people and the viability of a modernizing project for Brazil. Joaquim Nabuco, André Rebouças, Euclides da Cunha, Manuel Bonfim, etc. Not all were in agreement with this necessary relationship between miscegenation and degeneration. The debate on degeneration featured its own specific agenda in the construction of the nation, involving political, economic, as well as scientific, social, and racial issues. While seeking to transform the national identity and subordinate position that the country occupied in the international scenario, the Brazilian intelligentsia were opposed to some of the ideas and theories produced by the intellectual in central countries, but with which they could not, however, totally disagree, since their own prestige in Brazilian society had largely emanated from these same countries. In line with European racial theories, Silvio Romero, for example, doubted the existence of pure races either in Brazil nor in Europe. In his opinion, miscegenation was a definite factor, and even pure whites or pure blacks who lived in Brazil and did not yet have mixed blood were already intermixed through ideas and habits, and a study into common habits and language could attest to this fact. It was with this redefinition of mixture that Silvio Romero found the key argument to defend the viability of the Brazilian nation. Based upon the idea of the superiority of the white race, Romero considered miscegenation as a physical and cultural process geared towards producing a superior mixed race. His theory of racing whitening was based on this, when he presumed that the white race was dominant, so when mixed it would prevail, producing a progressively whiter-skinned Brazilian population. Taking the superiority of the white race as a starting point, many authors, such as Romero, began to support the idea that miscegenation and the imbalancing it produced were transitory, and that the progressive racial whitening of Brazil represented a favorable outcome that would lead to the modernization and normalization of society. In order to promote this process, an intense program of immigration was considered. So this Teixeira Leite speaks about this Modesto Brocco's painting. It's a former slave, thanks to heaven, for her grandson, pale skin. He is in his mother's arm, a mixed-race woman who has her white husband by her side. It tells about the idea of whitening the Brazilian race through gradual crossing. Okay. The risk involved, however, was that after becoming seriously mixed, the individual would not be susceptible to recuperation, as Magnum suggested. And this meant that a large number of the local elite remained very skeptical about the viability of the modern Brazilian Republic, in spite of the fact that the theory of racial whitening had gained support among the political, scientific, and intellectual milieu from the end of the 19th century until the period of the First Brazilian Republic. Because of Magnum's theory, in the end of the 19th century, psychiatrists were quite skeptical about Brazilian future. Raimundo Nina Rodrigues, one of the most important psychiatrists of the country at the time, well known in legal medicine and anthropology as well, heavily criticized both the theory of racial whitening and Silvio Romero, manifesting enormous pessimism with respect to miscegenation. He believed that social demands would generate a barbaric and savage streak in the mixed-race population, who were barely repressed by roles that were irreconcilable with their mental level. Supported by the polygenetic theory of degeneration proposed by Magnum, Nina stated that the country could only regenerate by preventing miscegenation, which he felt it was unviable. In his opinion, we were a nation of primitive and unbalanced degenerates, which would only get worse due to the process of modernization and the new demands imposed by civilization. In short, Nina Rodrigues opposed the theory of racial whitening as well as a series of other universalists and those related to spiritualism and free will, since he associated degeneration with physical and sociological anthropology. At the beginning of the 20th century, the capital of the Republic was facing a series of problems of infrastructure as well as those relating to the habits of the population and the disorderly occupation of the physical space of the central region. There were constant epidemics and the city was considered to be pestilential with an obsolete port. Because of this, in 1902, the President of the Republic, Rodrigues Alves, decided to give the engineer Francisco Pereira Passos, mayor of the city of Rio, the task of regenerating the city. The reform was being commonly known as bota abaixo, knock it all down, due to the large numbers of demolitions that required. Passos' reform, which sought to renovate Rio, the federal capital and an important port of entry for the country, followed sanitary standards of social medicine to scrutinize the situation in the city. The remodeling plan, destined to transform the capital into a modern and hygienic city, also included a sewage and sanitation project orchestrated by the new president of General Department of Public Health, Oswaldo Cruz. The physician who had studied at the Pasteur Institute in France was closely identified with the fields of sanitation and microbiology under the influence of the works of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, and in addition, on his return to Brazil towards the end of the 19th century, he joined the German-oriented study group of German bacteriology. His experience in experimental and laboratorial medicine led Cruz to understand that several diseases, once considered to be transmitted by decomposing animal matter or caused by racial degeneration, were in fact transmitted by germs and microscope agents. It was on the basis of this experience that Cruz began to combat the diseases and epidemics that were rife in the federal district. As happened to Oswaldo Cruz in 1903, the young Juliano Moreira, who received a scholarship to study in Germany and had come back a year before, was appointed director of the National Asylum for the Insane. Moreira, a miscegenated man himself, son of a black maid and a white Portuguese clerk at Salvador's energy company, took office in March 1903. As the great propagandist for the beneficial influence exerted by the 20 German clinics in study of mental illnesses and the epicenter of articulation between different psychiatrists in Brazil and German-speaking mental medicine, Juliano Moreira established reforms in assistance, created colonies for the insane, made structural reforms to the national asylum, and expanded German psychiatry on Brazilian country. It remains for us to understand how Juliano and his group managed to appropriate Kraepelin to the point where they amassed so much internal and international prestige. Some authors who have analyzed Kraepelin highlight the role that Degeneration had in Kraepelin's work, as well as his continued support of the French alienist concepts of degeneration. For example, during a theoretical seminar related to Kraepelin's centenary, highlighted his emphasis on the biopsychological constitution of the individual. Joel Bichmann also highlights the question of social risk caused by mental disturbances in Kraepelin's psychiatric discourse, close linked to a constitutional and endogenous, that is to say, the generative background, which suggests the return to the views expressed by Magnum and Legrand in the 19th century. Based on an epistemological analysis of a short text by Kraepelin on the Degeneration written in 1908, Sandra Caponi as well states that according to Kraepelin, there was a delicate scan of social facts and biological transformation which produced illnesses, debilitated bodies, and causes degenerations in family and races. This perspective led Caponi to consider that Kraepelin was in agreement with the agenda of physicians and alienists from the early 19th century. Caponi also emphasizes that Kraepelin, as well as Morel, referred both to the degeneration of individuals and families' lines, as well to the degeneration of peoples and races. Such interpretation may be made of Kraepelin, but this does not appear to be the way Juliano Moreira found as a solution for the mixed country. His reading of Kraepelin was closer to what which Erich Engström emphasized in the work of the German physician. According to this author, Kraepelin's concept was based on neo-Lamarckism and on a program of epidemiological research. When he embraces Kraepelin's concern with living conditions and their relationship to degeneration, highlighting issues such as poverty, education, and basic sanitation, as well as a belief in the criterion of the universality of mental illnesses, thereby suggesting a single classification for all countries. Engström states that the author found justification to take up a position against the raciological concept of degeneration. Unlike Nina Rodrigues, who defended the theory that miscegenation was a factor of degeneration, Juliano Moreira stated that degeneration should be linked to education and health, and was therefore a social problem. From this standpoint, Moreira only mentioned individual organic units as being responsible for pernicious heritage, and more, Brazilian could be cured via education. Thus, according to the author, problems related to heritage were linked to the bad quality of people who from the primitive times of colonialism, with their bad levels of education, were incorporated to Brazilian population. This being the case, the problem was not one of race, and the defects of our population should not be attributed to miscegenation. For this reason, the work of Hygiene should not be based on ridiculous prejudices about colors, of caste, as he said, but rather on the customs, the education, and health of the population. Thus, psychiatry was participating from a broader debate about impasses, interpretations, and directions from and into the country. With hygiene, education, and sanitation actions designed for Brazilians, they believed, it would be possible to recuperate individual cases of morbidity, prevent disease amongst its inhabitants, and create the conditions needed for the emergence of that promoted as being a healthy and modern population for the nation building. It's clear, said Moreira, that we cannot nurture hope of a decisive victory in the short term, but here, as has occurred in the case of other human diseases, a period of preventive hygiene will soon arise. Moreira stated that mental health could only be effective as prophylaxis against factors of degradation when this was handled without ridiculous preconceived notions about color. His proposal involved the creation of campaigns against venereal diseases and alcohol abuse, the conduct of hookworms and other parasites, to establish measures that would prevent procreation between perverted people, to apply eugenics precepts like hygiene, to provide eugenic education in schools, and to use new tools of science. With regards of these new tools, one of them was the use of psychoanalysis, the early use of psychoanalysis in Brazil. Moreira encouraged psychoanalysis as an innovative solution for local degeneration problems and backwardness. The idea of Freud's sublimation was considered in terms of its applicability to education and reorientation of sexual impulses to promote civilization. Following the same reasoning, psychiatrists from the Brazilian League of Mental Hygiene were in favor of detecting, controlling, and correcting abnormal behavior and sexual inclinations by means of psychoanalysis. Well, we have attempted to show that Brazilian intellectuals from the end of the 19th century, even though they have gone back to European theories, they did it in a specific way and associated with local problems, the question of degeneration and miscegenation being the main guideline for a good part of their debate. With the arrival of the 20th century, Juliano Moreira showed himself to be one of the most important psychiatrists to fight against the paradigms that had hitherto guided projects to modernize the nation. Armed with concepts interpreted from the Krapelian theories, he shifted emphasis from the raciological diagnosis about the backwardness of the nation when he gave new meanings to the theory of degeneration, now through an epidemiological perspective and in consonance with the sanitation project developed by Oswaldo Cruz. Finally, it's worth saying that this battle to establish a new direction for psychiatry received a huge boost, winning space in the country through mental health actions and the expansion of mental health care, as well as the dissemination of hospital colonies and agriculture colonies organized on this basis proposals, such as praxis occupational therapy, family and heterofamily unit therapies, as from the 1920s on. However, this did not mean that the question of race had totally died away, finished, and in fact, it gained greater force with Moreira forced retirement in 1930 and renewed their strength during the 30s under the totalitarian movements that preceded the Second War. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.